Safe, stable, affordable housing was first recognised as a human right in the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Yet, almost 80 years on, we're failing to fulfil this basic human need. The new government must consider how Britain tops the world league table for homelessness, while we are near the top for cost of housing, ranging from private rents to house prices, now at a 140-year high in relation to earnings. No government yet has grasped the myriad of nettles, whether the feudal arrangements governing leasehold or that almost 1.3 million people in England are currently on social housing waiting lists with a combined wait for council housing of 1,844 years. Two people at the coalface of this crisis are here with us today. Vicky Spratt has been the inewspaper's housing correspondent since 2019, detailing the destructive way our rental sector works in particular, winning awards for her journalism. Her book, Tenants, was voted Best Politics and Best Business Book of 2022. Quite an accolade. We also have Auriol Miller, a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences and CEO of Cynon Taff Community Housing Group, a not-for-profit organisation that provides quality, affordable homes for hundreds of people in Wales. Housing has been a devolved matter for the Welsh Government since 2015, so she'll tell us how the landscape differs from the rest of the UK. Welcome, both of you, to the We Society podcast. Can I start with you, Vicky? And I always ask this question, short answer, but just to get a sense of you. What's your reaction to being invited on the We Society podcast?
I suppose I was intrigued by the phrase We Society, because something I've been thinking about more and more in my work and in my reporting is how everything seems to revolve around the I these days. And I'm increasingly interested in collective solutions to the problems that we face.
And Auriol, your view?
I don't think anything happens by individuals alone, really. All great social change happens through collective work in some shape or form, whether it's following a leader or working together to construct a really careful policy that then changes the lives for people who are affected by the issue at hand. So everything is about convening, shaping action, making sure people are engaged and that their voices are heard. So it feels like a very natural fit from my perspective.
Well, thank you both. Now, back to you, Vicky. I mean, in the intro, I talked about top of the world league table for homelessness, top of the league table virtually for the cost of housing, incredible private rents, incredible house prices, a feudal system of land tenure and property tenure and leasehold in particular. And then 1.3 million people in England currently on social housing waiting lists. I mean, we could add to that. But if you had to single out one thing in that kind of cocktail of problems, or two or three things to be generous to you, identify which you'd move on first.
I am afraid I have to reject the premise of your question because I don't think you can single one out. I think they're all related. I think that you have to take a 360 approach to housing, not just in this country, but in any country. Based on 10 years of reporting on housing policy now, that's the conclusion that I've drawn. I don't think you can fix homelessness, end homelessness, without addressing the cost of private renting and home ownership. I don't think that you can separate out the feudal exploitation of leasehold, freehold, without looking at how the same ideology that is used to justify that justifies the rentier capitalism of private landlording. So I think it's all related. But what I would say, and the solutions are related, but what I would say is that rising homelessness, both rough sleeping and people, mostly families with children living in B&Bs and hostels, is the most urgent piece of the puzzle, and it needs dealt with yesterday.
It was an extraordinary piece of data journalism in the Financial Times recently, which said that the UK was the world leader for homelessness by a country mile. A real condemnation of where we are, and even going on to say that there was evidence that 55 children could have died from the consequences of kind of homelessness, let alone all the consequences on schooling and for the adults of holding down a job. I mean, it's an extraordinary, damning phenomenon, isn't it?
We're record-breaking in all the wrong ways. And rising homelessness has been something that politicians have been aware of for years now. Let's not forget that the Conservative government promised to end rough sleeping by 2024. It's 2024. It hasn't ended. It's increased. The number of people sleeping on the streets has gone up. This is not where our country should be. I actually wanted to have the subtitle for my book, Tenants, be Stories of Britain's Housing Shame, but my publisher said that was too tabloidy. And to this day, I mean, I still think that was the wrong decision, because I do think this should be a source of great national shame. And that reporting about child deaths, I broke that story last year, I think it was, for the first time, when that data had been collected by the temporary accommodation APPG and a brilliant organisation called Shared Health. They'd had access to the National Child Mortality Database, and I was looking at it. And the truth is that the real number of child deaths could well be higher. Those are the ones that were recorded, and they've only been recording temporary accommodation in child deaths for a few years. So we don't know how many children have died from mold, from living in a home where there are stairs that their parent has just been moved into that home and they can't get a stair guard.
I mean, one cause of that is the extraordinary failure to build social housing and replace the council houses that have been sold off. I mean, one of the first ports of call, social housing provided by local government, just doesn't exist on the scale it needs to.
Yeah, I think that social house building, and I'm sure Auriol has lots to say about this too, actually, but I think
I'll bring her in a second, yeah.
Yeah, social house building is the key, right? And that's not just my opinion. We've been here before. There is a reason that throughout much of the 20th century, in the interwar years and beyond, building social housing, call it council housing, call it municipal housing, was a key focus. And that was that politicians realized we had a really, really sick population. That might be ringing some bells for people who've been reading the news recently. We had really, really poor housing, and we had a very sluggish economy that was struggling to get back on its feet. And they looked at all of those metrics and they realized that building housing would not only grow the economy, it would keep people well, and it would mean that they were housed so that they could do other things. We have stopped building social housing at scale, and worse, sold off and demolished more than we are building. And it's no surprise that means we have a housing crisis. And if you look at any chart, you will see that the number of social homes and the lack of them correlates directly to the number of low-income families in the private rented sector, and now the number of low-income families who are being made homeless. Social housing is clearly the solution, and the lack of it is the problem. But for some reason, there is an ideological opposition, or has been in the last decade of government, to doing something about that. And it blows my mind, because you'd think that this is a really complex problem and the solutions are complex. I'm not convinced that that's true. I think we saw in the 20th century that if you build social housing, it is good for everyone.
Auriol, I mean, you're hearing Vicky, spell out so articulately the problem in England, but it's not as if homelessness kind of has ceased in Wales.
Vicky's absolutely right, and many of the problems still play out in Wales, but in slightly different ways. So our numbers are not quite as eye-wateringly shocking, but they're still shocking for the proportion of people in Wales too. So we've got about 11,000 people living in temporary accommodation at the moment, and about a quarter of them are dependent children. So all the issues that Vicky was raising, absolutely in that mix. But I think the intention of Welsh government is rather different to the intention of the UK government. And there's been a really big push for preventative work in Wales over the last few years. So yes, the ambition is really strong. So just to be clear, obviously housing is devolved in Wales, but still tied to England in some issues around that affect people living in social housing. So like policing and justice and welfare. And it's a different situation to Scotland, but I won't go into the intricacies of everything that's different about the different devolution settlements. That's for another podcast. So there's a really strong ambition in Wales, and housing has been a key priority within the Welsh Labour and Plaid Cymru Cooperation Agreement, which came to a very abrupt end a few days ago. We're recording this on 20th of May, and it ended just on Friday, just now. So we're not quite sure what's going to happen to those priorities. But there are key issues in terms of the delivery of some of that ambition that kind of go beyond the capability of Welsh government to effect. And that gets down to some of the fiscal issues that you were putting forward just now. But you're absolutely right. Cost of living impacting more on lower income households, disposable incomes falling by 7% over the next couple of years, rising interest rates, all the same cost of living issues that are affecting everywhere else in the country. But the thing we have to remember about Wales is that proportionately our population is older, poorer and sicker than the rest of the country. Our housing is some of the worst in Western Europe as well. We've got a layering up of issues that is really eroding and has eroded over recent years the resilience of local people across Wales to respond to the different shocks, stresses and uncertainties that affect them. So, and that's
what proportion of the Welsh housing stock is built before 1939?
Oh, gosh, that's a question. A huge amount is built before 1929. So all these things are the sorts of things you have to bear in mind when you're looking at the ambitions of Welsh Government in terms of the Welsh Housing Quality Standard that's just been enacted as of April this year. So how housing is brought up to the various different requirements to make sure it's energy sustainable and so forth by 2034. So a massive backlog and a really clear set of priorities, but also some, considerable obstacles to funding it as well. And when you think about the size of the Welsh Government budget, yes, RSLs, registered social landlords, can pull in an additional chunk of private financing. And we're talking 3.5 billion or so into the Welsh economy to deliver. But the intricacies and the delays and the issues around how you get new social housing built are really interesting. But I want to pick up on one thing, and this is partly as a relatively recent returner to housing, having worked in supported housing policy work over 7 years ago, now coming back in and seeing how the landscape has changed and reading between the lines on the language. So we're talking about the delivery of 20,000 new social homes in this current Welsh Government set of priorities in this Senedd term. So the Senedd is the Welsh Parliament, which ends May 2026. So that's not just building, but it's also repurposing existing homes and buying back homes that had been sold. So just digging underneath a little bit what the language is and what does that actually mean sets out a whole different menu of options in terms of how you actually do that. And that's the key thing at the moment. How do you actually do it?
Vicky, just to come back to you, as you hear Auriol speaking, I mean, the UK housing stock is phenomenally old. It's more than half of it built before the Second World War. The number of units that need to be simply kind of taken down and wholesale replaced is extraordinary. And that's before we get to all the issues you've just raised.
Well, I'm not sure that housing being old is always the problem, actually. I've visited lots of new builds, which are frankly absolutely atrocious. New homes that have been built for private sale in the last decade or so that are falling apart, covered, of course, many in flammable cladding, have lots of other building safety issues, missing fire breaks, for instance. So I don't know if you can simply say that just because homes were built pre-1930 that they're actually bad. But it is true that we do have particularly old housing stock in some parts of the country. And again, it's difficult to talk about the housing crisis in sort of broad brush strokes across the UK, because I do think that you have to take it at a regional level and come up with regional solutions. And that's true with housing stock. I was in Grimsby recently, where there are lots of homes that definitely need to be retrofitted and upgraded. But I think that's also true with affordability. So some places have greater issues with affordability. Let's take London in the southeast as the most well-known example than other places. But then you might have tourism hotspots, of which there are many in Wales and also in Scotland, where you need to bring in very particular affordability measures too. So I think actually that point about housing stock and the quality of it speaks to the need to look at every part of the UK and say, okay, so what do people need? What are the problems that they are facing and what will work? And it's not always the case that we need to knock down the homes that are there. Sometimes that is the only option and it is the best option. But I have seen some really, really, really good retrofitting, and I'm not convinced that we always need to demolish and start again.
Yeah, it's so particular because for every home that you can say, built before the First World War where the retrofitting has worked brilliantly, there's another one where it's simply impossible. But as you say, it's particular to particular parts of the country. What if you wanted to really launch social housing in the UK and a social housing revolution, allowing local authorities to borrow? I mean, scrapping the 1961 Act, which obliges local authorities, the Land Compensation Act of 1961, which compels local authorities to buy land, including the hope value if it's developed, so that private owners of land yield the benefit of potential development even while they're not developing it. I mean, there's 101 things one can imagine. I mean, as a woman who's kind of written about this extensively, just give us a view. And Auriol, I'd like to come back to you as well to hear what your thoughts are in Wales. But Vicky first.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think lots of people have said this. I'm not the only one who thinks that hope value should be scrapped. So sitting on land should not be more lucrative than building homes on land. The problem we've got is that the inverse is true often. So scrapping hope value would be a really, really good place to start. And actually, there is something quite simple that the government could do that would make it easy for local authorities, or easier rather, to build social housing, which is bring back housing targets. I've spoken to so many investors who have said they would love to invest in social housing and in fact think it's a safer bet than building homes for private sale right now because of where the mortgage market is. But because we don't have housing targets, specifically affordable housing, social housing targets, they don't think it's safe to invest because they don't know how many need to be built. So I think scrapping housing targets, which happened under Liz Truss but has remained, was probably a really big mistake because investors have been spooked by that. And you could bring them back very quickly. You wouldn't have to pump any more of taxpayers' money into the system. You would find investors who want to build social housing and they think that it would bring a good return for them. And I'm really interested in the policies that are going to come out from Labour in weeks and months to come. Because I was in Cornwall recently looking at a new garden town that's being built, Langarth, which is a really, really interesting proposition. And Cornwall Council have used compulsory purchase orders in a very robust way to get land back from private developers into local authority ownership to build this new garden town. And if that could be replicated across the country, if councils felt confident in compulsory purchase, I think you might see a lot more council house building.
Auriol, come to you.
Can I just jump in on the kind of issue around social housing supply? Because I think we're talking about lots of different types of things here, whether it's building, issues in the private rented sector, and issues of affordability. I mean, there's a really shocking stat that one of the key think tanks in Wales, the Bevan Foundation, came up with last year, which was that there were only 32 properties that were available at or below local housing allowance rates in February 2023. So that's about 1% of properties advertised on the formal rental market. And Vicky's right in terms of bringing up how this plays out differently in different parts of the country, because one of the things that lots of people in England like coming to do, and Scotland and elsewhere, is coming on holiday to beautiful parts of coastal Wales and mountainous regions of Wales. And one of the actions that Welsh Government has taken has been to allow local authorities to charge up to 300% of council tax, additional council tax, on second properties in Wales. It's been hugely controversial. inevitably, locally, people tend to really like it unless they're in the tourist trade for understandable reasons. And it's something that needs to be, is still settling in. And not everybody is charging that full amount.
So the English rule is 100%, but in Wales it can be 300%. Yeah?
It can be up to 300%. And I think Gwynedd has charged 150%. So it's a really complicated picture. So yes, absolutely, in terms of building more and developing more social housing. But like I said before, that can be also repurposing and buying back. Now, one of the, in Wales, we do have a target, and it's 20,000 social homes by 2026. And I think we're somewhere currently about 6,000 or so, and we've got a couple of years still to go. And obviously, understandably, people are getting very twitchy about whether it's going to be possible to deliver against that target. But often it's around planning delays. So you might have planning, but you might not have the SUDS approval, so that's Sustainable Drainage Systems approval, which you now need to have at the same time as your actual planning approval, plus obviously rising costs due to inflation hitting across the board, and supply chains as well of labour. So all sorts of issues in that mix. But I think there's a really strong sense of willingness across social housing to step up to the game. But issues around, there's a lot of reform coming through all in one go. The new Welsh housing quality standards will apply right across the board, but they require significant investment. And there's no great clear sign of where that's coming from at the moment. And when you also think that Welsh Government's budget has been hit because of inflationary costs, that's really difficult. That's the sort of thing that will spook investors in terms of the ability to deliver on the action plan.
What about an incoming Labour government pledging that it's going to do what it takes, whatever that may be, to kind of organise planning so that more can be built, especially on brownfield, but also some green belts. I mean,
so that's an interesting thing. We've got a new First Minister in Wales as of a short while ago who's restated his commitment to enable more development by social landlords. But it's really not clear how he's going to do that. And as you say, planning goes beyond. That is also devolved from our perspective, but it's a wider issue in terms of some of the intricacies of that. I know that there's work going on in Wales looking at how publicly owned land or land owned by Wales-based institutions that could be freed up. How could that happen? And how could that be developed into new social housing? So some of that work is going on. But again, it goes back to these are piecemeal efforts rather than that larger picture.
Just a brief pause in the conversation to tell you a bit about the Academy of Social Sciences, which is the organisation behind the We Society podcast. The general election may be over, but that's only the beginning for the new government, as it has many pressing challenges to sort out. From education to the economy, every aspect of our society is crying out for fresh ideas and solutions. Social science stands ready to step up to the plate. I'm Will Hutton, the president of the Academy of Social Sciences. We're a national body for academics, practitioners, and learned societies in the social sciences. We champion the vital role of social science in our society, from education to government and business. You can find out more about the Academy of Social Sciences work, support us, or read up on our fellows by going to the website acss.org.uk. That's acss.org.uk. Now, back to the conversation. Vicky, I mean, you've been patrolling this area for 10 years. Have you kind of recommendations, insights into how planning law should be changed?
Yes, in short, and I don't think it's as complicated.
I didn't think you'd say no. Actually,
I was about to give you a far more long-winded answer, but yes, and I don't think it's as complicated as people, and by people I suppose I mean lots of policy wonks and politicians make it out to be. I think what Labour are proposing, if they could pull it off nationally in partnership with local authorities and regional governments, is probably the way it needs to go. And that is local development corporations, which are like the ones we saw after the Second World War, which bring together local experts and get homes built that local people can afford. I thought that Labour's proposal on grey belt, which is reclassifying the low-value bits of greenbelt land for development and prioritising them for development, was also a very smart way to reform planning without having to go through the rigmarole of legislating, which, as we've seen over the last year, has really, really come back to bite Housing Secretary Michael Gove, who's wanted to reform planning, and his reforms have been watered down very significantly from where he started. So I think what Labour are proposing in that respect is really smart, because they'll be able to hit the ground running with something like grey belt. They'll be able to hit the ground running with development corporations. They're not trying to reinvent the wheel. They're actually doing things that have been tried and tested. But I really think, and Auriol's touched on this, partnership with local experts is key. You can't impose a strategy from Westminster. I think what you have to do is have guidelines that then go to local experts to be thrashed out. And you do have to consult communities. I think that this manufactured culture war between YIMBYs, yes, in my backyard, and NIMBYs, not in my backyard, which loosely is the pro-building lot and the anti-building lot, is a complete mess and a distraction. Talk to people, build homes in places where we need them, but obviously build them sensitively. I don't think this is rocket science. And somehow, whenever I write about planning, I get more emails in my inbox telling me I'm an idiot than if I write about anything else. It's such an emotive subject. You wouldn't think people could get so het up about planning. But believe me, they can, based on my inbox. But I just think it's not that complex. Build homes where we need them. If you live in a suburb of London or a home county and you've got kids who aren't going to be able to afford to live near you, you're going to care about this, right? I don't believe that there are people all over the country in beautiful places who are so protectionist that they want their children living a 3-hour drive away from them, which is what I recently witnessed, by the way, in the Lake District. People who'd grown up in social housing in the Lakes who now can't live near their aging parents because they can't afford to. We need to sort this out because it is destroying communities.
So planning, we've looked at scrapping hope value, a commitment at the local level to build. It's all possible. A lot of other thorny nettles to grasp, actually. I mean, rent control. I mean, both of you are in favour of indexing rents. How would you make a system work that would avoid some of the very bad impacts of rent control as it developed in the 50s, 60s and 70s? And I speak as someone who lived in 2 rent control flats, and they were the landlord had zero incentive to they were completely ghastly, although we as students enjoyed them. But I mean, there's downside to rent control as well as upside. What's your view?
Well, if I can go first on this, Will, for registered social landlords, obviously we're highly regulated by the Welsh Government here in Wales. So there's a really clear process for how rents are set. And just last week, the Minister for Local Government Housing and Planning, Julie James, has issued a statement on rent setting. So there's a 5-year agreement, I think it is off the top of my head. It's just been extended for one last year. So normally it's CPI plus 1% if inflation falls to between 0 and 3%. But, really clear mechanisms for how registered social landlords set rents through tenant and feedback and engagement, affordability data tools, affordability models like the Roundtree Foundation's Living Rent model, all sorts of, references to data sets across the board, but also an assessment of that wider financial pressure on tenants, including household costs and energy costs in particular, and service charges too. And so what Community Housing Cymru, the umbrella body for RSLs here in Wales, did a few years ago.
RSL, just to read.
Registered Social Landlords. Yeah, I talked about it before. Registered Social Landlords developed a set of affordability principles that really, does what it says on the tin, that housing associations adopt these principles of obviously total costs of renting homes and incomes to understand what's affordable for tenants, that it's sustainable, that allow us as businesses to continue to provide high quality quality, safe and warm homes. Obviously, we're not-for-profit organisations. That we engage our tenants, that things are fair as well and set fairly, and our homes and services represent value for money, but also that we're accountable, we're open, transparent and accountable when we make decisions on rents. So I think if we're talking about rent setting, we have to make a very clear distinction between what social landlords can do and what they absolutely cannot do.
And could that be expanded into the private rental sector?
I don't see why not. I mean, I think one of the key things that Vicky and I both agree on is that a house isn't just a house, it's a home. It's a place from which everything then starts. You feel safe, hopefully warm, and you can afford to live there. But it's a place from which education, training, employment, retirement, care, everything else is possible from that starting point. So the important thing for us here at Cullen Taff Community Housing Group, for instance, is that we don't just build houses, we build homes and we develop homes and we support communities. And that's a key difference in terms of how we operate. So why not? Why not extend these things to a wider sector? But there are huge practicalities in that mix, but it should be possible.
I know that we're approaching a hard stop with this fascinating podcast, but one thing we must discuss is home ownership itself and the very high level of land and house prices in Britain, 140-year high in relation to earnings. That, again, is a whole damn problem.
Yeah, I think, obviously land is the key issue at the heart of all of this. And, one of the things that we're waiting to see how it pans out in Wales is one of the priorities in the cooperation agreement, which is INOS, which is the intention to set up a publicly owned company answerable to the Welsh Parliament, to the Senedd, that would raise long-term finance and assemble public and private land, promoting good practice in terms of construction and Welsh supply chains, to really get at, go back to the beginning of this podcast, that collaborative approach to solving a problem which is knotty and gnarly, and we need to get through it. So we don't quite know where that's going to land, sorry for the pun, in terms of what comes next, but absolutely. But there's one thing I wanted to pick up again, Will, before we close, which is, and it goes back to an issue which I think is crucial. How are we capturing, and are we capturing, I don't think we are, where people actually want to live when they come in to local authorities, for instance, and getting on the social housing register? Because that plays into absolutely Vicky's point around where do they want to build their futures in terms of families, communities, opportunities, education, training, whatever it may be, because that's really where it comes down to that choice. And I don't think we're capturing the voice of people in as uniform and consistent a way as we could be doing.
Vicky?
I think where we are right now in Britain really, really requires us as a nation to take a long, hard look in the mirror and ask ourselves and our political leaders what kind of country we want to be. Take politics out of the equation. Take competing economic theories out of the equation for a moment and ask, do we want to be a place where people have access to home ownership if they are high earners or they have rich parents, and everybody else will either have to make it work in the unstable and unaffordable private rented sector, or, God forbid, end up on a social housing waiting list, or worse, in temporary accommodation, in poor quality hostels, B&Bs, converted offices on industrial estates where there's nowhere for their kids to play, shipping containers that are too hot in the summer and too cold in the winter? Or do we want to be somewhere where there is a mixed housing market with different tenures, where the people who need it have access to secure and affordable housing for as long as they need to live in it? I think it's really clear what kind of country I want to live in. But for some reason, that is out of reach for our politicians. And I don't think it can continue. I think we're already beyond a crisis.
Vicky, Auriol, I mean, thank you so much. You've given us a kind of window into a revelatory window. I think we all know the nature of the housing crisis, but you've both gone a level deeper. Vicky, your book, Tenants, is remarkable, and thank you for your interventions. And Auriol, I think Wales is certainly trying to more progressively crack this nut than England, but plainly got a long way to go. Maybe if you get the scheme to kind of compulsorily buy private and public land off the ground, I mean, you may make some progress, and it may be a trailblaze for what should happen in England, but this is a problem that's been escalating, building for 50 years, and it needs, as Vicky said so eloquently, it needs to be unscrambled and unscrambled fast. Thank you both very much.
Thanks, Will.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the We Society podcast. I'm Will Hutton. The episode was produced by Emily Finch and was a whistle-down production for the Academy of Social Sciences. Be sure to subscribe to the We Society on the podcast hosting platform of your choosing, so you can be the first to hear new episodes, and go to acss.org.uk to learn more about the Academy of Social Sciences.